So before we get started, let's go ahead and we'll open with prayer. So, Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things, the giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. So we're getting ready, as mentioned, to start our series going through the life of the prophet Moses. As I mentioned before, this one is going to start out very similar to the way the last two about the prophet and King David and Abraham were, in that we're gonna end up, as I mentioned, probably not tonight, but we're gonna end up starting at the beginning of the book of Exodus and going through. But then some of you may be happy for this, some of you may not be happy for this, but we're not then going to go all the way through Leviticus, Numbers, the whole book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and all of Deuteronomy to get to the end of Moses's life. The way with David, we could sort of go straight through the second half of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, or with Abraham, we could just go through those chapters of Genesis, starting with chapter 12. Because we would most definitely get lost in the weeds, I think. And the focus of this Bible study for the Antiochian is very much on these men in the Bible and their lives. And so when we start getting to material that isn't directly related to the life of Moses, when we start getting to measurements for the furnishings of the tabernacle and what kind of goat hair the curtains should be made out of, and when we start getting the census data in Numbers, we'll start skipping some of that stuff. We're going to end up working our way through Exodus through Deuteronomy, but we're going to be sort of skipping some portions we're not going to go through in Leviticus in detail, what you do with the fat above the kidneys of the calf. And we're not going to necessarily go through. I have a podcast where in not too long we'll be looping around and going through verse by verse. So if you're into that sort of thing will be available for me in another venue. So here we're going to be focusing on the life of Moses as such. So that said, with Moses especially, even more so than with David or Abraham, there's this weird tangle of historical issues and scholars arguing and fighting with each other and all kinds of things that we kind of need to go over, at least in an introductory way, here before we get started. And that's why, as I've now mentioned, I think 3 times, we're probably not going to get into the text of Exodus tonight, because there's a whole bunch of these to talk about. Some of these things, I'll be honest and say now, aren't things I find particularly interesting. There are a lot of people who get really excited about trying to pin down the date of the Exodus, and I do not find that as interesting and exciting as a lot of people do. I'm going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to kind of try and explain what the issues are and why people fight about it, but I don't have a lot of enthusiasm for any particular side, like which particular century that ends up being doesn't matter a lot to me. So I'm not going to give a kind of vigorous argument for one position. That's the main thing that we'll get into tonight, that is something that I find relatively tedious, but that needs to be covered, and so we'll cover it. Some of you may find it fascinating. If so, first, I'm sorry that I don't, because I don't support you. But if you find it fascinating, there's tons and tons of literature online and everywhere else to read about it, that you can go and dig into that and find out more. But so to start with, as we open, we're going to be opening in Egypt. And we're going to be opening. So we last talked about the life of Abraham. The rest of the book of Genesis, after we left off, talks about the life of Abraham's son Isaac, the life of Isaac's sons Jacob and Esau, and then the lives of Jacob's 12 sons, focusing for the most part in the last third of the book of Genesis on Joseph. And Joseph ends up bringing the family to Egypt to escape a famine. Joseph also ends up being able to do that because he has achieved a certain amount of rank and status in Egypt. And then we have a lapse of time. I'll get to it a little bit, how much time, because again, how much time is debated based on when people think the date of the Exodus is, but there centuries pass, right? Literal centuries pass, no matter when you date it, to between Joseph's death and when we're going to pick up at the beginning of the book of Exodus with the descendants of Israel. This is Israel, the person, right? Jacob's name gets changed to Israel by God. So the descendants of Jacob in Egypt. And we're told that this is at a point where Jacob has been forgotten, or Joseph has been forgotten, meaning that the sort of status that the descendants of Jacob had in Egypt while Joseph was a high-ranking court official, that is now also gone. And so as we pick up, we will find the descendants of Jacob essentially enslaved. The Egyptians, throughout their ancient history, frequently made use of foreign labor, right? And they referred to, in Egyptian terms, the people from the Levant, like what was Canaan and the Near East, they referred to them as Asiatics. That's sort of how their word for those foreigners translates. So from their perspective, the descendants of Jacob would have been like any other group like that. They were and were used because they were foreigners. The Egyptian word for person, for human, is the word that they used for other Egyptians. Right. So there's one word in ancient Egyptian that is translated both human and Egyptian, meaning that built into their language was the idea that anyone who wasn't Egyptian was sort of subhuman, right? It was sort of a lower caste automatically, right? And so the Asiatics, putting them into slave labor, the Egyptians looked at very similarly to the way they looked getting oxen to do labor, or getting horses to do labor, right? Or to pull a chariot. So we need to kind of get out of our heads our sort of modern notion of rights, right? Whether it be human rights or rights of citizens, because even someone who was an Egyptian, right, did not have rights the way we think about it, right? But for example, if an Egyptian was murdered, that is something that would be investigated and punished, right? Whereas outsiders, Asiatics, and other outsiders, not necessarily, right? It would be looked at more as killing an animal. So if they were someone in particular's slave, that would be seen as sort of a property crime, what we would call a property crime. So that person might have a case against the person who killed his slave in that sense. So we do need to, however, disabuse the notion, because a lot of people have this in their heads for some reason, that the Israelites, that the descendants of Jacob were in Egypt building pyramids. The pyramids had already been there for a long, long time by the time we pick up, right? So they were building things. They were building buildings. They were building cities. They were building temples. They were building public buildings, public works. They were not, however, building any pyramids or the Sphinx. The Sphinx was already ancient at this point. Those kind of things that we may have in our heads. So speaking of how ancient, right, everything already was. So by the conventional dating, the first sort of villages and beginnings of civilization started in Egypt around 5500 BC. So as far back as you can go in terms of, I'm sorry, 3500 BC. So sort of as far back as you can go, 5,500 years ago, 3,500 BC. As far back as you can go, civilization is getting started in the Nile River Valley. And that is for one basic reason, is that when you're dealing with early agriculture has not yet developed techniques for fertilizing fields, doing extensive irrigation, and that sort of thing. So if you're in a river valley, you have this advantage of seasonal flooding. So every spring, the river is going to expand past its banks. It's going to flood, and then it's going to retreat. And when it floods like that, it's going to wash down silt and deposit that silt along the banks of the river. And so that silt that gets deposited along the banks of the river is very fertile. The river sort of fertilizes its own banks every year, seasonally. And so very early agriculture, some of the first civilizations started around the Indus River in India, the Nile River, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, because the seasonal flooding allowed a place to plant that could be relied upon to bring forth a stable harvest of crops every year. And this fact, the fact that the only thing really sustaining life, human life in the Egyptian civilization, is the river, is reflected sort of everywhere in Egyptian literature, especially in Egyptian religion. The Nile, right, because it is the source of what they're going to use to feed themselves, is seen as the source of life. It's also obviously where they're getting their water. So water and crops are both coming from the regular flooding and retreating of the Nile. And so they saw the Nile as sacred. They saw various gods as associated with the Nile, spirits associated with the Nile. And this is going to come into play. The reason I'm laying all this Egyptian groundwork is that I'm trying to lay groundwork that's going to come into play. You may already be thinking, if you're familiar with the story of Moses, about the plagues and how some of the plagues affected the Nile, right? This is part of why. So Egypt is, so just mentioned, one of the most ancient, relatively stable civilizations on the planet. It's really Egypt and India sort of have the lock on that, in that Mesopotamia was not so stable, right? So in Mesopotamia, you have Sumerian civilization, Akkadian civilization, Babylonian civilization, Assyrian civilization, back and forth, rising and falling over the course of history, but there's still an Egypt, right? And there is still in India. So in terms of civilizations that existed relatively stably, it's not that they were never invaded. It's not that they ever experienced sort of economic and political collapse. They did at various points. But that particular civilization continued nonetheless. And so by the time we get to, for example, we saw when we were going through the life of Abraham, Abraham visited Egypt at one point. And when Abraham visited Egypt, that was already a century into what's called the Middle Kingdom. So Egyptian history is divided in a whole bunch of pieces. The ones most people have heard of are the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And by the time Abraham in 2000 BC is already a little ways into the Middle Kingdom, to give you an idea of how old the Egyptian civilization is. So after those settlers in the Nile Valley, what forms is what's called the pre-dynastic period, which basically is called that just because it's the period before the Old Kingdom, right? Before sort of the first great dynasty of pharaohs. And in the pre-dynastic period, Egypt is divided into two parts, and Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And they're the reverse of how we instinctively look at maps today. Because we instinctively, all of our maps, at least in the Western world, are all oriented toward north. So north is up, right? But Upper and Lower Egypt are in terms of the river. And the river flows south to north. The Nile River flows south to north. So the delta is in the north. And so the northern part of Egypt is Lower Egypt, and the southern part of Egypt is Upper Egypt. And that's the reverse of how we think about it. But even when we get to the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, when Upper and Lower Egypt are united, even when we get to that point, Egypt is still exists and is aware of this distinction, right? And we could maybe kind of think of it as, in the United States, there's still a North and a South in the United States, right? Now that meant something different before the Civil War than it means after the Civil War, than it means today, right? So today we would, most folks, I mean, I'm down here in southern Louisiana, so there's a few out in the bayou who still don't think they're part of the USA, but most folks, whether they live in the South or the North, consider themselves citizens of the United States, right? Consider themselves American citizens. They're part of one country, and these are two regions within one country. Before the Civil War, that was not necessarily the case, right? In a lot of cases, you were part of a particular state, and that state was either in the South or the North. There was a certain kinship there. So that's very comparable to what happens.
I always wondered why Northwestern University wasn't in Washington State.
Yeah. So that's very comparable to what happens in Egypt, right? Because in the pre-dynastic period, you start having the rise of kings, but these are like kings of cities. And these kings of cities start to be able to, much the same way as what happened in Mesopotamia, start to be able to sort of project their power and influence over smaller neighboring towns and villages and cities, right? And so over the course of the pre-dynastic period, and we're talking pre-dynastic period, we're talking like early third millennium BC. So we're talking like the 2900s BC. So these villages start turning into cities. Those cities get rulers who we would call kings, and they start to be able to, the city extends its influence over neighboring farming sites, villages, towns, and you get a relationship where the king in the city is able to tax those folks, those neighboring folks, and in return serves to protect those folks from other such kings who might want to come and take what they have, and anyone else who wants to come and take what they have. So over the course of the pre-dynastic period, that process continues, and you get to a relatively united Upper and Lower Egypt. Not that there is sort of one king over the whole thing, but that you get a system of relationships between the different major cities and agreements, and certain kings are seen as sort of elevated above others based on their power and health and influence. That balance shifts. I mean, we're talking over the course of centuries. That balance will shift. A city will become more powerful and influential, and then less so because of various things that happen. But it's sort of the civilization is starting to organize itself. When you get into the Old Kingdom, more toward the middle of the third millennium BC, this is where you get something resembling a pharaoh. This is where you get someone who manages to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. And the fact, though, that Upper and Lower Egypt still exists is reflected in a lot of places. One of the interesting places is the Hebrew word for Egypt. The Hebrew name for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which is plural. Right? It's actually a dual. So it's still it's the union of these two places, right? Is what it becomes. So the Old Kingdom is where we see in the pre-dynastic period, you get some of the earliest sort of pyramids and monument structures, the very early step pyramids, very early, not very tall obelisks. It's when you get into the Old Kingdom proper that you start getting things like the pyramids we know about, the pyramids that we would go and visit, the pyramids that are famous. There's a lot of debate about the dating of the Sphinx. That's why I didn't mention that, because there was one conventional dating of it, and now that's gotten redone because they did some more excavations, and now they think that the time they thought it was built may actually be a time it was sort of renovated, and it may have actually existed earlier than that. But that's a little far afield because the Sphinx does not appear in the Book of Exodus. But the Old Kingdom is also where we start getting a lot of Egyptian literature. And because of one of the reasons we know so much about Egypt and its history and its religion is that Egypt's climate, being dry and arid, makes it really good for preserving papyrus, which is what these things were written on, and preserving just about everything else, right? The best way to preserve something is to sort of suck all the moisture out of it, right? And then that keeps it from rotting, decomposing, right? It will preserve it for a very long time. So we have texts going back to the Old Kingdom period, detailing rituals, telling stories of creation, stories of the gods at that time. And so there's this whole flourishing of Egyptian civilization that happens before the narrative in the Bible, right? As it says of Abraham, right? Actually starts, right? So all of this is well into the past in Abraham's day. So in between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, and then eventually the New Kingdom, there are these intermediate periods, they're called. So they're called intermediate periods because these are places where Egypt gets struck with sort of financial crises, economic crises, political crises, foreign invasions, and those things. Well, the foreign invasions, right? If someone tries to attack Egypt and Egypt is strong, they lose, so it's not an invasion. But if Egypt is going through massive upheavals and difficulty in their society, and somebody attacks, it turns into an invasion because those people win, right? Because Egypt isn't able to repel them. And so you have the respective dynasties sort of collapse. There's a period where usually foreign invaders, right, are in power. In the first intermediate period, they don't really take power. There just sort of isn't a strong power and authority, right? Things go back to sort of separate city-states. Everybody's trying to protect themselves. Invaders are coming and picking things off. The Middle Kingdom began around 2165 BC, so about 165 years before Abraham. That's why I say it was already underway by the time Abraham went there. And that was, again, where a pharaoh came who could kind of pull everything back together. And so that's why we see Abraham meeting Pharaoh. We see that there's a relatively stable society at that point. The Middle Kingdom would also end up collapsing for some of the same reasons. And you could throw into that, there is in the second millennium BC, which is where we're going to be spending our time in the book of Exodus, regardless of your dating. That's especially in the latter part. We mentioned this when we were talking about David. The Bronze Age civilizations that existed at that time pretty much all collapse. So there's a lot of social upheaval. There's a lot of migrations of people. The Sea Peoples come and try to invade Egypt. Now that's going to happen kind of between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, a lot of these things. But when the Middle Kingdom sort of comes to an end, when things break up, it's at the hands of foreign invaders again. And those foreign invaders are called by the Egyptians the Hyksos. So because people need to write dissertations and publish journal articles, there's intense debate as to who exactly the Hyksos were. The Hyksos are described as being Asiatic, so they came from somewhere else in the Near East. They're depicted as having beards, which the Egyptians, you may have noticed this in movies and things about ancient Egypt and depictions of ancient Egypt, that everybody seems to be bald, right? That the men all shave their heads and the women all shave their heads, and they wear sort of wigs and fake beards and right, stuck to their chin and this kind of thing. That's accurate. They'd even shave off their eyebrows. That was a major part of Egyptian culture. And the reason for it was sanitation. It was to control lice, fleas, right, ticks, other pests. And so the Egyptians considered anyone who sort of let their beard grow, who was swarthy looking, to be sort of a filthy barbarian, right? That was seen as unhygienic, right? And so when we see depictions of people in Egyptian reliefs who are depicted as having beards, right, that's a clue to us that, oh, these are foreigners, right? And the Egyptians are trying to depict them as sort of dirty foreigners, right? So that was an Egyptian thing. Now I don't know that the guy liner that Yul Brynner had the Ten Commandments. I don't know that that's entirely accurate, but the bald head was. Yul Brynner also, by the way, Orthodox, buried in a monastery. So this is one of the ways we know that the Hyksos were Asiatics, is that they're depicted as having beards all the time. This is also why, even though at some point I think we'll probably do the life of Joseph, but we haven't yet. But this is also part of why Joseph's brothers do not recognize him. Right? He's there. It's not just that he's older, it's that he's older. All of his hair is shaved off, right? And he's wearing traditional Egyptian, sort of garb and stuff. So he that's why he looks very different than they do. So the Hyksos come and invade, and the Hyksos actually take over. There are Hyksos pharaohs. They call themselves pharaohs, right? Sort of their leadership make themselves the king of Egypt for a period. And then after that period, the Hyksos rule is thrown off and the new kingdom begins. So now we have to get into the dating of Exodus, right? Because we're in that range, right? So the Exodus is happening on either the early or late date within the new kingdom, right? There are two dates that are usually suggested, and I'll explain what they are and why here in a minute. But there are two dates that are usually suggested for the Exodus, and both of them are in the new kingdom. But based on which one you pick, that sort of slides Joseph forward or backward on the relative dating, right? And so that makes this Hyksos period relevant, because on some dates for Exodus, that puts Joseph in the Hyksos period rather than the Middle Kingdom period. And so then you get into people doing this sort of detailed analysis. Well, wait, the Hyksos pharaohs had beards. How would they recognize, right? Going into detail. So as I just brush over that, people go, right? This is sort of my issue with the dating thing. So the whole argument, and this is mainly in evangelical Protestant circles, and it's mainly there for a reason, is engendered by the fact that most modern ancient historians, and by that I mean starting with the 19th century, and yes, our 19th century German friends are implicated highly in this. Ancient historians and biblical scholars have just rejected the idea that the Exodus happened, that there was any kind of large group of Semitic slaves in Egypt who escaped in this dramatic way and then went and migrated to Canaan. Kind of the best you get from them is they say, well, there may have been a small group of escaped slaves who showed up telling these stories and then sort of rabble-roused a bunch of people in Canaan. I'll go ahead and say this. So the going theory now in Old Testament scholarship, if you have the misfortune of sitting in on an Old Testament section at the Society of Biblical Literature, is that the Torah, the Pentateuch, Joshua, that's all bogus. And what really happened is basically a Marxist peasant revolt in Canaan, right? So they will say that this group of escaped slaves from Egypt showed up preaching this new god they were worshiping. They formed a revolutionary vanguard party that got the peasants who were tired of being oppressed by their Canaanite overlords, roused them up to have a revolution, and that's where Israel came from, right? And then they sort of got together and concocted this whole myth of the Exodus and Joshua and all this. So that's dumb for a variety of reasons, right? Like, even regardless of what you think of Marx in terms of economics and his critique of capitalism, right? That is still dumb, right? Because you're projecting sort of what Marx himself would call bourgeois, like revolutionary ethics. Like, you're trying to take the French Revolution and put it into the middle of the second millennium BC, right? When people weren't thinking and interacting politically and that kind of thing in any respect like that, right? But it's kind of the best you could do if you set aside everything in the Bible and just try to go on the non-existent evidence that we have, right? So the non-argument, as I just laid out, that sort of linchpins that whole approach is that they say, well, we have no archaeological evidence for the Exodus, right? We don't have any archaeological evidence that this happened. Now, we don't have any archaeological evidence that most things in the ancient world actually happened. They're recorded in a text somewhere. But because those texts aren't the Bible, we accept them as history, right? But when it comes to the Bible, of course, that's all bogus for these folks. But the response to that kind of modernist approach to history and to the scriptures, from what were once called evangelical fundamentalists, then fundamentalists became a dirty word, and so now it's sort of evangelicals, was equally modern. The less skeptical, but equally modern, in that they said, no, we're going to go out and find archaeological evidence, and we're going to prove, right, that every detail listed in the Bible is true, right, is just literally historically true. We're going to go prove that doing archaeology and using modern historical methods and modern scientific methods. We're going to prove it's true. So that's a flawed response already, right? That you're trying to answer the results of a bad approach by following the same approach and trying to get better results, right? So it's a very flawed mode, right, of trying to counter an argument. But so because of that, if that's your goal, if your goal is, I'm going to use these modern methods, I'm going to prove that this stuff really happened exactly the way the Bible said it. Well, now you're going to have to dig into the Bible and try and figure out, okay, when exactly does the Bible say this happened, so that I can go look and find that evidence. And so here you run into a difficulty, which is, if the authors of Scripture, ultimately God, right, wanted us to know exactly when the Exodus happened, it would have been very easy for him to tell us, right? Like, the pharaoh could be named. That would be the easiest way, right? We're going to see this person who's just referred to as Pharaoh. They could have said Pharaoh so-and-so, right? And then we've got a spot right there, right? So it would have been very easy, but the authors of Scripture, ultimately God, chose not to tell us that. That in and of itself should make us question whether we should be trying to dig through the Scriptures to try to figure out what the Scriptures could have easily told us but didn't. But these folks do. And so when you dig in, you could make pretty good arguments for two different dates. And part of the issue is, I know we've talked about this before in this Bible study, is that numbers become, like literal numbers, not the book of Numbers, literal numbers become tricky in the Old Testament and in all ancient documents. This isn't just a problem with the Old Testament or something. This is just all ancient documents because they didn't have numerals, right? The numerals we use, right, on your numeric keypad on the side of your keyboard are Arabic numerals. They're called that because that's the language they came from. Right? Before that, there were Roman numerals, right? But we're a long time before Rome. So there aren't numerals. So when you express a number, you do it using letters, right? So you'll use like the 6th letter and then like the 9th letter and then, right? So that automatically causes a whole bunch of problems, right? Because, for example, sometimes the particular number you write, the letters you put down spell a word. So then when we read the text, were they trying to say that word or were they trying to say a number? Right? So that creates a problem. And when you're talking about the Old Testament scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures get translated from Hebrew to Greek. And so when that happened, the Greek translators had to figure out, is this a word or is this a number? Right? And what number is this? And sometimes the Hebrew we have and the Hebrew they were looking at when they translated it into Greek are not the same. Right? So it's not just that they did a bad job or something, it's that there were different versions of the Hebrew text. And so one of the things that gets slippery, and you know this, if you've ever compared like the Orthodox Study Bible or another Old Testament translated from the Greek to any other English Old Testament that's translated from the Hebrew, you'll notice all the numbers are different. You get to numbers of people, numbers of years people lived, all those kind of things. Even something simple like we saw early on when we were talking about David, Goliath's height, right? Goliath is 9'9" in the Hebrew text we have now. He's 6'6" in the Greek. Right? So, I mean, even just a little number like that, right? I mean, for people at the time, he's huge either way, right? But even little numbers like that, right? So trying to construct a chronology of the Old Testament based on those numbers gets really tricky, right? And especially for our evangelical friends, this gets tricky because they are using our current Hebrew text called the Masoretic text for their Old Testament. And they want the folks who are involved in this project of trying to prove the Exodus want to prove it's right in every detail, including the dating, right? So in First Kings, in First Kings, there's a date given of how many years after the Exodus Solomon's temple was built. And so they have this, okay, here we have this in our Hebrew text. This will help us date the Exodus. The problem is St. Paul gives a date between Abraham and the Exodus, or from the time of Abraham to the arrival of the land. And St. Paul just quotes the date from the Greek Old Testament. And so our friends who are engaged in this project are using the Greek New Testament. And so they also want to say that St. Paul is correct with this other date based on this other text, right? And they want to try to prove both dates correct in some way. And so you end up with one date that's kind of based on St. Paul and one date that's based on the Hebrew of First Kings in terms of the proposed dates. And then people fight back and forth and they pour over, right, little details in the text of Exodus and other places to try to argue for one date or the other. And my position, as I said, is basically that there's no way for us now to know the exact date. And if God and the authors of Scripture had wanted us to know, they could have very easily told us. So I'm not into that whole thing. But they'll point to, we're going to see the Israelites, one of the cities they're being forced to build is called P. Ramses. So they say, oh, the proponents of the late date see, that's Ramses. That means it has to be this later date, because that corresponds to this pharaoh. And then the people who want the early date look at that and say, oh, well, look, here's all these places in Exodus where place names have been updated. They just updated that one too, right? So this argument can't ever go anywhere, right? There's not going to be, like, unless we're out in the Egyptian desert and we find this papyrus, like hand signed by Moses, telling us what year it was, right? This argument will never be settled, right? Till we're in heaven, right? So it's a little fruitless. But the two dates that are commonly given are what's called the early date is in the 15th century BC, so in the 1400s BC. And then the late date is in the 13th century BC, so the 1200s BC. So where the dates are 200 years apart. Okay. To even further confound this, right? What makes this even more complicated and more of a pain is that recently, the whole chronology of ancient Egypt has been thrown into question, because we have, going back to a certain point, really solid dates. But the dates we're talking about are well before that point. And so what we're doing is, when we try to construct the chronology of the ancient world, and by chronology ancient world, I mean of the whole ancient world. Like, we're trying to say, here's what's going on in Akkad, here's what's at that time, this is going on in Egypt, this is going on in Canaan, this is going on in India, where we're trying to match up, right? So each of these civilizations have left a certain number of records, right? So it's one thing to go into a given civilization and look at their records and say, okay, here's the succession of kings, here's, this invasion happened, but then when you take all of those civilizations' separate records and you try to line them up with each other, things get super tricky, right? So, like, you have to look for, okay, well, this guy says he went to war with Egypt during his reign as king. We find in Egypt a pharaoh who says he went to war with somebody from that direction at that time. This must be the same war, right? But that's always tentative. That's always us just trying to match it up, right? And you have to add into that the fact that all of these ancient Near Eastern kings were complete narcissists, right? So we have Egyptian records where literally a pharaoh will say he went into battle against these people. He destroyed them utterly. He wiped them from the face of the earth. And, he lost 3 cities and half his army and came home. And you're like, what? Right? Like, they would just declare victory no matter what happened, right? And so in most wars in the ancient Near East, right, where both sides survived, both sides didn't always, sometimes it's clear who won because the other side is wiped out, right? But wars that happened and both sides survived, both sides claim victory in their official records, right? So that complicates everything further. But so when we're trying to date these things in the Bible, we have this ancient world chronology that we're trying to fit the biblical data into. Well, if scholars come along and say, hey, we've got the ancient world chronology wrong, we need to shift this here and that there, and to make this all work better, that takes all your house of cards with your biblical dates and throws it up in the air, right? And all this has to be redone. And so now there's a big movement based on redating Egyptian chronology, to try and say maybe the Exodus happened in the 16th century BC, the 1500s, an even earlier date. That date, like if you put a gun to my head and forced me to choose a date for the Exodus, right? I would not die over this. So I would tell you, I would pick one. And the one I would probably pick is that new date in the 16th century. Because the new date in the 16th century BC, even though that doesn't match up with any of those biblical dates I just gave, has one big advantage. And that is that there seems to be some actual Egyptian evidence in the 16th century BC. So we know there were groups of Asiatics who left certain cities in the Delta in the 16th century BC. We have some sort of weird Egyptian documents talking about these apocalyptic signs in the sky and weird things happening in the 16th century. So there is kind of some stuff there, right? So if you really want to have your historical archaeological evidence for the Exodus, you can kind of get it in the 16th century. But that's off the table for most of our evangelical friends, because they're focused on proving these certain numbers in their authoritative versions of the text being accurate, right? And so that the saga continues, basically. So all of that said, any of those dates were in the New Kingdom, right? So we're relatively the same background setting. We're in the same general Egyptian civilization. And so I don't think we need to firmly establish or argue for any of those. I needed to address it, I think, but trust me, I wouldn't have if I didn't think I needed to. But in terms of talking about the life of Moses, this is the Egyptian civilization in which he's living either way, in which he's going to come up. And so the New Kingdom is an heir to an already ancient civilization that has risen and fallen a couple of times. We're going to run into the guys who are usually called magicians in English translations when they come up. They are what are usually called by historical scholars lector priests, not Hannibal Lecter. This is lector as in reader. Yeah, if there's anybody who's tortured a reader in your church, feel free to start calling them a lector. And if they have a PhD or are a medical doctor, you can call them Dr. Lecter if you want to. But the prior person of these priests, we tend to think, because we're modern people, that priests were priests like I'm a priest, right? That these ancient priests like led people in worship, like led people in worshiping the pagan god. But that whole idea of a priest leading in worship is really a Christian thing. Even like our contemporary synagogues today, the idea of having a rabbi who pastors sort of the local Jewish congregation is kind of adopted from the Christian paradigm. Like the synagogues that St. Paul visited didn't have a rabbi in charge, right, of that synagogue, right? They had visiting people, different people would preach, more than one person. It was a very different kind of thing. But that pattern is a Christian thing. So ancient priests, across the board, ancient priests were specialists in certain things, generally in ritual, right? So you have like priests who are haruspeks, who are priests who administer sacrifices, and a haruspeks is in charge of reading the entrails of the sacrifice. So we have these little models like of livers and kidneys, right, made out of like fired clay with little markings and words written on them that they would use to study, right, to learn this stuff, right? So they had the knowledge of these are the signs to look for in the entrails to predict the future when we offer the sacrifice, or just knowing how to do the sacrifice, knowing how to divide the meat, knowing how to do the procedure. In Egypt, what was particularly important at this point was being able to read the ancient texts, right? So Egypt had these ancient texts on the walls of the temple. They had them on parchment. right? They had them preserved, but most people could not read. Hieratic is not easy to read, right? Ancient Egyptian is very difficult to read because it's a pictographic language, as you've seen if you've ever seen hieroglyphics or hieratic. And when you have a pictographic language, that means you don't have just like a 22 or 24 or 26 letter alphabet, right? You have literally hundreds and hundreds of characters. This is true of cuneiform too, because cuneiform was really pictographic originally. But so learning to read was a very difficult thing. The Coptic written language was created by Christians. It was one of the first, several alphabets were created by Christians, but it was one of the first. And what they did was they took spoken Egyptian at that time and put it into Greek characters. And then there were a bunch of sounds in spoken Egyptian that didn't match up with any Greek letters. So they invented, I believe it was 6 more characters for those 6 sounds in spoken Egyptian, right? But that was because when the time came to try to translate the Bible and other Christian texts into Egyptian, that you couldn't do it into hieratic, right? Like that's not a thing, right? That could happen. And so, but before that, you're dealing with hieratic, you're dealing with this pictographic language. Hieratic actually, hieroglyphics are pictographic. Hieratic, it had developed into kind of a consonantal syllabic alphabet, meaning each symbol, each picture was like a syllable. So it'd be like ka or pa or da or ba or, right? And then there would be another symbol for bow and another one for do and one for ko and one for, right? But as you can imagine, you're still dealing with hundreds of symbols. So the primary jobs of these priests, and the reason they're called lector priests, was that they were able to read, right, these texts. And they were charged with preserving them, copying them, and then reading them in order to perform the various rituals, the various ceremonies, the sacrifices, everything that went on with regard to the gods in the temples, right? And so those are the folks who we're going to see when Pharaoh starts getting into trouble with Moses. Those are the folks he's going to call, right? To say, hey, what's going on here? How do we fix this? What do we do? Right? Because that's their whole job, is they're sort of cultic librarians, right? For Egypt, right? And so that's what's going on with sort of priesthood in Egypt at this time. We also tend to think, this is true of Greek and Roman religion too, we sort of have the Justice League model of ancient religion in our head, where, you know, like there's these 12 men and women on Olympus who have different superpowers, right? Like Hermes or Mercury can run real fast like the Flash, and Zeus throws lightning bolts, and, you know, right? And so we have kind of the same idea of Egyptian religion, right? Where we kind of have this constructed pantheon. You've got Re, a lot of people pronounce it Ra, the sun god sort of at the top, and then you've got Anubis and Osiris, and they have different animal heads, and right. And we sort of have this idea that they're like a group, there's this group of gods, and everybody worships this group of gods. That's not really how it worked. Going back to that pre-dynastic period, those individual cities and places all the way back then each had their own sort of god, or their own god or two, right? Their own spirits who were related to that community in that city, who were worshipped at the temples in that city and the sacred sites around that city, right? And so as the city-states came together, as relationships were formed, and then moving forward into the earliest dynasties, when Egypt gets united, right, what happens is that these gods, these spirits who are being worshipped, also get united, right? So Pharaoh, depending on what city Pharaoh has as his capital, the capital of Egypt moves around all over the place over the course of Egyptian history. that at certain times they have summer and winter capitals. Sometimes one in Upper and one in Lower Egypt. But as the capital moves around, wherever the capital is, the god of that city ends up being the top god, right, of the pantheon, the god who Pharaoh is associated with. So at different points in Egyptian history, Pharaoh is associated with Horus or with Re, the sun god. Horus is the one with the falcon head. That's associated with Pharaoh. But then Pharaoh, when he's in another city or in another place that worships other gods and other spirits, he'll also offer sacrifices to them, right? And so that's where we get this idea of a pantheon, in that the sort of unity of the kingdom is shown by the king acknowledging the gods of all of these other places that he's brought into his kingdom, right? And sort of his God rules over their gods the way he rules over them, right? It's sort of the idea. And that's how they come together. But the relative ranking and importance of different gods shifts between Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and even within those kingdoms. As particular cities become more important, their gods become more important in the religious life of Egypt. As they become less important, those gods become less important, right? And this isn't just a purely sort of crass political thing, right? It's the idea that's in their heads, as in most of the ancient Near East, is that things in the spiritual world are mirrored in the material world. Right? So the fact that the city now no longer has the prominence it once had is seen as being the same thing as the idea that that god must have suffered some misfortune, up to and including dying, right? That something happened. And so you will then find a story that gives a spiritual explanation for what happened, that may involve a god being defeated by another god, or that sort of thing. And this is common throughout the ancient Near East and also in Egypt. And the Egyptians also were very interested in astrology. And so they saw what was going on in the sky as sort of a mirror of both what was going on in the spiritual world and what was going on in the material world. So there was sort of this third thing in between. This is why the sun god becomes so important, right? Because the sun is seen as sort of ruling the sky, right? And then Re rules the gods and Pharaoh rules Egypt, right? And there's sort of a line drawn between these things in the New Kingdom. But that's important to remember in terms of their religion, this mirroring for, again, certain of the plagues and those kind of things that we're going to see, right? That when those relationships get broken, right? What happens when there's 24 hours of darkness so the sun no longer rules the sky? What does that mean for Pharaoh? What does that mean in terms of what God rules in the spiritual world, right? So it's important that we understand that connection. They saw these three layers, right, as being intimately connected. The Pharaoh's main job, we talked about in the pre-dynastic period, that these early kings, their job was sort of primarily defense, protection. They're basically getting paid protection money by farmers and outlying villagers, right, to keep them safe from harm. The pharaoh's job was to preserve justice. The Egyptian word is ma'at, and justice is, for the Egyptians, was pretty much the same thing justice is in the scriptures that we've talked about before. Justice is when everything is in its correct place, everything is in harmony, and everything is working correctly. So it's the pharaoh's job, his one job, is to preserve that and defend that, right? And make sure that that continues happening. So if, right, the Nile doesn't flood as much as it usually does one year, that's, in the material world, a problem. Pharaoh was expected to address that, right? Pharaoh, they believed, was divine. Pharaoh had access to the divine world. He needs to address that with the gods in the spiritual world. He needs to address that in the material world, right? And if he doesn't, he's failing in his job, and his dynasty may collapse, right, over it. His job is to preserve everything working in harmony. And so this also is important going into when we see the plagues, when we see some of these other things, that if Pharaoh can't do that, then that means Pharaoh isn't who he says he is. He isn't divine. And if he isn't divine, then he shouldn't be ruling Egypt. And if he should be ruling Egypt, somebody else, there are plenty of other candidates who would love to come and rule Egypt instead of him and set up their own dynasties. So there's a major issue there, right, for the pharaohs. I think that may be probably enough introduction. I think there are some other things that I was maybe going to talk about, but I think we'll come to them as we go through the story. And I think most people will enjoy it more if we talk about them when we come to them and reading the Bible, as opposed to me just continuing to prattle on here now. They'll be a little more relevant to what we're talking about at that point, like Moses's name and some of these other things. But so that's just a little bit of background and a little bit of particularly pointed cultural background that's going to stand sort of behind a lot of the story that's now going to kind of unfold. And next time we'll get started right at the beginning of Exodus, with where the descendants of Jacob are, what's going on, and then we'll lead into the birth of Moses and talk about how that is or isn't related to the birth of Sargon the First and other interesting things like that.
Father, I'm hoping we can still do a Q&A if you have the time.
Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, just feel free to either type it out in the chat and Father Stephen can respond, or just feel free to come off of mute. We do have a comment in the chat saying, awesome study. Thank you so much, from Peter. Appreciate that comment. Also, a thank you from Bruno. Is there anyone that
I
has
think Theodore might add a question.
Yes, I have two questions. The first question is about justice and the pharaoh being the one in charge of justice. In Canada, when you go to court, it's the queen, the crown versus Ted versus me. So, and if I've read a little bit about the monarchy that exists today in England and in Canada, they're outside of the law. So if the monarch was to commit a crime, he cannot be prosecuted. And also the monarch is the one that you go up against in a court of law. And the prosecutor and the judges, the prosecutors wear wigs and they accuse you, they work for the crown. So was the Egyptian pharaoh in a similar manner the one in charge of justice like the English monarch?
Yeah. Yes. Now they didn't have a court system per se. The pharaoh had officials in different parts of the land, and those officials were authorized to sort of settle disputes and resolve problems, but they had a free hand in doing that. There didn't have to be a trial. There never really were no juries. That idea didn't exist, right? So it was the official, pharaoh's official, would hear what happened, come up with a resolution. That resolution could involve executing people. It could involve, right, seizing property, whatever he wanted and felt he needed to do. And the only person overseeing what he did was Pharaoh, right? So if Pharaoh had a vizier or another official who did something he didn't like, right, or who was acting in a way he didn't like, or was failing to keep the peace, right? If he was in charge of, you're in charge of these towns and sort of maintaining peace and prosperity here, and that official didn't do it, then Pharaoh would probably have that official executed or made into a slave and right, appointed someone else as the new official. to do a
That's a
better
great
job.
question. I wonder if Moses picked up on that when Israel continued to grow and travel and move, and then captains of hundreds, captains of thousands, and who sat in judgment, and where would people go if they had debates or concerns or conflicts. I wonder how much of that was an outgrowth of Moses' exposure to Egyptian rule.
Yeah, it is part of it. And he has a conversation before he does that. He has a conversation with Jethro, his father-in-law, who we'll talk more about when we get to him. But Jethro is a Midianite, so he's a nomadic group. And in a nomadic group, it was sort of the head of the whole big extended family, right? Whoever the patriarch of that big extended family was, he was the one who made those determinations. But yeah, so Moses, having grown up in Pharaoh's court, same kind of thing. It gets to a point where Jethro says to him, "You're spending all day hearing people argue about who stole whose goat, you know, like you have other things to do. You need to appoint some overseers, some elders of the people, right? And stuff to oversee these things and handle these things for you." But yeah, so what Moses does is sort of a combination of the way things worked in Egypt and the way things worked in a big nomadic household kind of put together. And those weren't that different, right? Those aren't incompatible, because as another part of the answer to the question, Pharaoh was very much above the law, right? Pharaoh issued the laws. The law was whatever came out of Pharaoh's mouth, right? So obviously, if he said something and then was a hypocrite, he could just say, "Oh no, it's okay when I do it," right? And then it's okay when he does it, right? That's because we talk about, like, we talk about Hammurabi's code, right, from the ancient Babylonian Empire, that he set up this code, which technically is not a law code, right? Because a law code technically is a thing that is sort of self-existent, right? When you set up a law code, it exists. Everyone, including future generations, are subject to it, right? And it is something that is sort of established in perpetuity. What we have from Hammurabi on a series of stelae, like publicly placed things, are actually his edicts regarding how certain crimes should be punished and how certain things should be done. But those were just his edicts. That was not establishing anything in perpetuity for the future or anything like that. And so that kind of law more resembles like what's kind of called household laws, which would be set up by like the patriarch of an extended family, right? Here's the rules in our household. Here's how we're going to conduct ourselves. And you're accountable to that head of household for it. The same kind of thing with Pharaoh. Pharaoh would say, "Here are my edicts. Here's how these things are to be handled. Here are my officials who will enforce it. If you violate it, you'll answer to me," right? And then again, this was another place where Pharaoh could jeopardize his own position. If people were getting away with things that Pharaoh had prohibited and he wasn't able to enforce, right, his will and enforce those laws, he would again end up being sort of trivialized, and that would be where someone else would come in and start a new dynasty because he was ineffectual.
When you were talking about Pharaoh always being right, I was going to make a joke that it sounded like he was viewed as infallible, but I don't know.
Well, he's a god.
Right, that's true. So how can you be wrong, right?
Yeah.
So Derek has his hand raised virtually. It looks like he has a question. Derek, do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, nice one, Michael. Got a good chuckle on me there. Anyway, in the spirit of, let's say, questions that I've heard from more of a modern perspective, and also I was talking to somebody from our parish, it feels like you need to go to people where they're at, connect to people where they're at, something like Paul did in his ministries. I've been pondering something I heard, and I'm also using the spirit of, we can say what it isn't more certain than we can say what it is. And this is even concerning with dates, because I know you don't like dates. My question is,
I just find it boring. I just don't find it interesting discussion.
I completely get it. Anyway, I digress. So when it comes down to it, there's in the Garden of Eden, after the transgression, it's stated that, you know, death came into the world due to this transgression. And I don't know how to, like, because I, you know, obviously believe in creation, like creation, and God created the world, but I don't know how to square that away, because one of those things that's an issue for people to kind of come into it and start believing is I say they worship the creation and not the creator. So they think the creation created itself. So that kind of lines into the idea of death being the means of evolution. But right there in Genesis, it says death came into the world at that point. So I'm wondering how you square that away, if you've looked into this all, if you heard anybody else, because I still know how to, you know, reach to people and give them more besides just a question and ask for their own common sense. Have you ever heard of this, looked into this at all? What would you have to say?
Yeah. So, yeah, the age of the earth is another thing that I'm not interested in. But no. So to me, I want to be nice about how I say this. But I don't think it's true that there's anyone who doesn't become a Christian because they believe in quote unquote believe in evolution. Maybe not anyone. The people who actually believe in evolution are really scary people, right? Because what does it mean to believe in evolution? Right? If we're talking biblically, right? If we're talking biblically, the word belief, the word faith, which really means faithfulness, right? So belief in a biblical sense doesn't mean like I put the right answer on the true false test, right? So there are lots of people out there who will say, Christians and not Christians, who will say, yeah, life evolves, true or false. They would say true, right? But that's not really what we would mean when we say somebody believes in something, right? Like if saying you believe in God or you believe in Christ, we don't just mean if someone gave you the thing saying, is there a God, you would put T, right? Like that's not what we mean, right? What we mean is that you live your life in a way that's faithful. If you live your life in a way that reflects the fact that there's a God, that reflects the fact that Christ is the Son of God, who died and rose again to set you free from sin. So what does it look like for a person to live a life that's faithful to the idea that life is purely a random thing that happened, that there is no purpose, that it was complete accident over and over and over again, and the organisms that survive and thrive on this planet are the ones that are the most efficient and ruthless killers, and are able to subjugate and dominate the others, right? I mean, I could point you to people historically who have lived a life faithful to that, right? But they're not anybody you or I would want to be friends with. And they're usually not the people we're talking to who bring up evolution.
So, Father, that sounds like a path to either nihilism or like transhumanism. Is that where you're going with this?
Right. You end up like Matthew McConaughey's character in True Detective, right? Like, you know, like there really is no, if that's really how you think the world works, and not only works, but that there is no other ought.
Yeah.
Because who would give an ought? Who would say you ought to be kind and compassionate, even if it's to the detriment of your own interests? Who is there who can say that in that situation if there is no divine, right? So the folks we're talking to don't actually believe that. And because they don't actually believe that, that's not stopping anybody from becoming a Christian. Right? But part of the problem is we've approached, I don't even want to call it a Protestant way, a very watered down evangelical Protestant way. We've approached Christianity, even as Orthodox Christians, which is being a Christian means you believe that these certain things are true. And so preaching the gospel to someone or trying to get someone to become a Christian or trying to get someone to become Orthodox is us trying to convince them that those things are true through having an argument, right? I don't see that anywhere in the scriptures. I don't see the Apostle Paul doing that. Here are my premises. I will now argue that each of these is true. There are not many gods, but one God only. There is not, right? Like, and here's why. Here's my mathematical proof that, like Plato, that the what is unified is greater than what is disparate, and therefore the divine must be one, right? Like, that never happens, right? The saints don't do that. The martyrs don't do that, right? That's not in our tradition. So I don't know why we do it, right? What shapes actual belief in the sense of faithfulness and that kind of thing is being part of a community and a way of life. And that's what we should be doing. We should be seeking to live in community together with the people in our parishes, living the Christian way of life. And we should be inviting people to come and join that community and that way of life with us. All right. And then as they're doing that, these other things that we say about where the world came from and where it's going, right, and what it's about, then those things make sense to them, right? Then those things click for them down the road. Right. But that's, yeah. So that, and I think at least here, I don't know what everybody else does as priests in terms of catechesis and stuff, but somebody comes to me and tells me they want to join the church. I say, good, just come here for a year. Right. Come be part of the community, get to know us. We'll get to know you. Right. Come to services, come to our celebrations after services, eat meals with us, right? Go and visit people, spend time with people, right? And become part of the community. And along the way, any questions you have about anything, I'll do my best to answer. Right? Rather than, okay, you need to attend these 5 lectures where I will make you memorize the dates of the ecumenical councils and get you to accept the correct conjunctions between theological terms, so that you're Orthodox and not a heretic, and then you'll be all set, right? That's a very, again, I have more respect for most Protestants. So that's a watered down evangelical Protestant approach. The idea that it's about mastering certain knowledge or agreeing to certain premises. And so we need to get away from that and get back to community and a way of life and a way of being in the world as a way to address these things. Because you could, otherwise, it's just like the argument about, the age of the earth, the dating of the Exodus. You can go round and round about that forever. And you're not going to get anywhere. There's no silver bullet. There's no solution. That's why there's been a debate for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and you kind of end up missing the point in the process.
Yeah. You don't know what the Exodus means. You just have a very firm position of when it happened.
Right.
And who was Pharaoh at the time.
Yeah. That's a really beautiful response, Father. Do you have time for one more question? Seth has his virtual hand raised. So Seth, would you come off mute for us?
Yep. Thank you, Father.
Seth, based on your name, who did you replace?
I'm sorry.
No, never mind.
No, I just figured I had a really weird dog head.
The word Seth means replacement in Hebrew.
Right. So I guess in this case it'd be Abel, right? I thought it was chosen.
Who you replaced.
I'm just glad you didn't ask who I killed.
Right. Well, if your name Cain, I would have questions for your parents more than you.
I guess so. I'm going to do my
my jokey coast to coast amen question first. Pyramids are a galactic battery, right? And then two.
No. You're slightly off. The Ark of the Covenant is an electrical capacitor.
That's right.
Yes.
It's not quite
my Ed Dames moment, but
there it is.
Yeah. And you might have gone over this. I was feeding my son, so I
missed a bit. So we talked about Pharaoh being a god. So to the Egyptian understanding of the time, and I imagine maybe this changed over the different dynasties. Would he be considered sort of like an incarnation of a god, like on Earth? Was he an avatar of a god, or was he a new member of the pantheon, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, so it depends on the period in Egyptian history. So one of the things that's a little different about Egypt, as opposed to other ancient Near Eastern civilizations, who all had god kings also, right? But their god kings were not seen as being one of the existing gods, right? So sometimes they were a child, they were part divine, part human, right? 2/3, 1/3, right? The whole Nephilim thing. But they were not seen as like an incarnation. Or with the Egyptians, it's a little different. It's not quite so. Incarnation isn't necessarily wrong technically, but it was conceived of very differently than our understanding of like Christ's incarnation. Right. So in order to interact with a spiritual being in the ancient Near East, including in Egypt, that being had to be embodied. Right. And so and any given god could have any number of bodies at any given time, right? So this is how idolatry worked, right? You made the statue, you did the ceremony where you open its nostrils, the spirit entered into it. That idol is now a body of that god, meaning that's a place where you can go to interact with and interface with that god. Egypt did not have a lot of oracles. That was more of a Greek thing, and a Hittite thing, and a few other places. But that's where the spirit would possess a human, right? So the oracle at Delphi was possessed by Apollo. So that was another way of embodying the god so that you could interact with it. In Egypt, because we have this mirroring thing, right? At the period we're talking about in the New Kingdom, we're talking about Re, primarily the sun god. So you have Re, the sun god, the spirit. You have the sun, like the sun in the sky is one of his bodies. The pharaoh is one of his bodies. And all of the statues, right? The idols of Re and all of the temples are his bodies. And he was seen to coexist in all of those bodies at the same time. So it's not like when Pharaoh was talking, the sun disappeared from the sky, or like we're doing a sacrifice to this idol, so Pharaoh disappears or something, right? But this was seen as sort of continuous. So it's a different than like the oracle at Delphi, who would periodically get possessed by Apollo to deliver messages. With Pharaoh, it was a persistent thing for his whole physical life, right? His whole
divine passive ability, if you will.
Yeah. And even then, his remains were still seen as being a body of Re that you could go and sacrifice to and go on.
So how does that fit with the idea you mentioned, sort of, the death of gods, this sort of dynastic movement of, one city becomes more prominent than the other city? Because to me, that seems like there's and maybe I'm reading too much into it, a sort of cosmological paradigm of a constant divine conflict, and not just the big ones, like Seth and Horus, for example, but sort of like a low-grade conflict between, all right, well, we liked the crocodile one over here, but then we got destroyed, and so now it's Re over here. How is that understood? Kind of, it doesn't really seem a good versus evil, but more of a might makes right. And then how does that also imply or undergird belief? Because if, for example, if your god gets, essentially, if you're a god king, etc., that whole divine enchilada gets cast down, then what do you do? And then, of course, how does this seem like how does it affect your sort of wider cosmological view?
Yeah, well, you get assimilated into the victor's religion,
Okay.
right? So this is, you see, a place where you see this play out is with when the Assyrians come and destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. Sennacherib, their general, goes and then lays siege to Jerusalem, and there's this dialogue, where he comes and he says, hey, yeah, I know you guys are trusting your God, like, to protect you. And he says, all these other cities I conquered, they were expecting their gods to protect them too. Right? He sort of does this smack talk, right? Like, I'm not worried about your gods. My God's better than your God. And then, of course, he ends up eating crow, right? Because his army gets wiped out. But that was very much the mindset. That's very much the mindset. And that's why this is especially prominent in Ezekiel, but in other exilic prophets, right? That there is this counter explanation. This is really what's going on in 1st through 4th Kingdoms, or 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. It's important to instruct the Judahites in exile in Babylon that, hey, this didn't happen because Marduk is more powerful than Yahweh. Because that's how the Babylonians would have understood it. They said, look, we just took you all into exile and made you slaves. Clearly our God is more powerful than your lame God, right? And so you need to just forget about that and worship ours, right? And so this counter narrative of, no, Marduk isn't even the one who did this to you. Yahweh's the one who did this to you. Yahweh, the God of Israel, did this to you to discipline you for your sins.
Okay.
And he's the one who's going to deliver you out of this later. But that was countering that ancient narrative of, clearly whoever the gods are who won, right, they're the most powerful.
So that's that sort of puts another nail in the coffin of a sort of the ancient Near Eastern divine justice league, then, because it always seems like there's a threat of internal conflict.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's how they would explain these different shifts. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Father Stephen, thank you for staying over with us. And I usually like to confirm with Father Stephen for the following month. And if that's okay with you, Father, I think we have September 15th scheduled. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't see any issues with that.
Okay, September 15th, we'll have our next Bible study and dive into scripture. Great introduction tonight to Egypt, and as we get ready to talk about Moses in particular. So we'll pick this up on September 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central Time. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining.